Let the Epstein class fight the Epstein war.
Why doesn't Trump release the Epstein files? What is he hiding? If they release the Epstein files, then maybe we'll put the American booze back on the shelves.
A single interview on Canadian television turned a boring trade dispute into something much darker.
So the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer said this past week that the U.S. is at the end of its rope when it comes to the province's alcohol bans. Secretary Lutnick has called it insulting and disrespectful to America. Manitoba still has that ban in place. What is your reaction to those comments?
Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew sat down for a national television interview about trade and walked out having said something that no provincial premier and arguably no elected official in Canada's modern political history has said out loud in a live broadcast context. The interview started where all these interviews started: tariffs, retaliation, the liquor ban, the usual framework of the Canada-US trade conflict that has been playing out since early 2025. Kinew handled all of that the way he has handled it consistently throughout the dispute, directly, without diplomatic softening, with a clarity of sequencing that leaves no room for misinterpretation. The position on the liquor ban has not changed. This was an unprovoked attack on Canada on the trade front, Kinew said, and it is Trump's administration that did it. If they want the American booze back on the shelves, they need to take the tariffs off Canadian products. That is the exchange. That is the condition. The sequencing is non-negotiable, and it is not complicated. He said it with the same directness he has applied every time this question has been asked. The reporter pushed back on the obvious question. What leverage does a single province really have against the most powerful economy on earth? It is the question that frames the conventional analysis of Canada's position throughout this entire conflict. The assumption that size asymmetry automatically translates to power asymmetry, and that Canada is therefore operating from a position of fundamental weakness, regardless of how confidently its premiers and prime ministers speak. Most politicians in this situation talk about GDP. They talk about steel prices. They talk about integrated supply chains and mutual dependencies. Kinew did something different. He stopped talking about the economy entirely. He got quiet. He shifted his tone. And then he said that Donald Trump clearly does not like it when the Epstein files come up and always does something pretty wild when they do. So he was floating it as an idea to put the American administration on the back foot. Maybe Canada should demand the release of the Epstein files as a condition as well. The newsroom went quiet. The internet did not. The clip moved immediately across every platform where Canada-US trade content lives. Not because of its policy substance, it has no formal policy substance. Kinew explicitly framed it as a floated idea rather than a demand, but because of the specific political territory it entered. The Epstein files carry a particular charge in American political discourse that has nothing to do with Canada, trade policy, tariffs, or liquor shelves. Kinew identified that charge and use it deliberately, in public, on camera, to generate attention and discomfort in Washington through a mechanism that has nothing to do with the conventional toolkit of provincial trade diplomacy. It was improvised, pointed, and effective as an attention device. But while the internet was consuming that clip and generating its reaction, something more consequential was happening on the ground that the cameras were not following. At a softball tournament in Niagara Falls over the weekend, players who would normally reach for American beer were reaching for Canadian alternatives instead. Individual consumer choices that started as government policy responses have completed the transition into something more durable, a shift in purchasing behavior grounded in national identity and sustained by broad public support for the boycott position. The polling data attached to that behavior is the number that should actually concern American trade officials more than anything Kinew said on television. New 2026 research from Nanos shows that over 80% of Canadians now believe that boycotting American goods is the only effective way to win the trade conflict. 80% is not a coalition of the already committed. It is a national consensus crossing political affiliations, regional identities, and demographic categories that rarely agree on anything. A government policy position that commands 80% public support is not a political liability for the officials implementing it. It is their most reliable political asset. The economic mechanism that is turning this from a symbolic consumer story into a genuine commercial problem for the United States is the one Kinew explained directly to American viewers. By taxing Canadian materials, the United States was raising the price of its own domestic products, including beer, which requires Canadian aluminum for cans and Canadian barley and hops for ingredients. American tariffs on Canadian inputs increased American production costs, which were passed through to American consumers in the form of higher prices. The refunds that followed the Supreme Court's ruling on the IEEPA tariff regime are flowing primarily to the businesses that paid the tariffs initially, not to the consumers who actually absorbed the cost increases through their purchase behavior. American consumers paid higher prices because of the tariffs. The refunds are going to corporations. The people who bore the cost of the policy are not the people receiving the compensation from its partial reversal. Kinew told American viewers this directly on Canadian television, knowing the clip would cross the border. That is a specific political communication strategy aimed at an audience that is not his constituency. American voters in the districts and states most exposed to Canadian trade retaliation, in the hope that their pressure on their own representatives is more politically effective than any formal diplomatic engagement between governments. It is the same strategy that Ontario Premier Doug Ford deployed when he appeared on CNN to tell American viewers that the tariffs were costing American jobs and American economic output. Provincial premiers have been systematically taking their case directly to American domestic audiences, rather than exclusively working through formal bilateral channels, and Kinew's television appearance followed that pattern. The broader strategic movement that Kinew's interview exists within is the one Mark Carney has been building for 18 months. A systematic diversification of Canada's economic relationships that reduces the degree to which any single bilateral pressure campaign can produce the compliance Washington expected. Canada has signed 20 new economic and security agreements across 5 continents in the past year. Non-US exports are up and on track to double within the decade. Foreign direct investment in Canada is at its highest level in 2 decades. The Canada Strong Sovereign Wealth Fund has been established. New trade agreements with India, ASEAN, and Mercosur are in progress. The United States calculated that economic pressure on Canada would eventually produce the quiet apology and the concessions. What Washington is discovering instead is a country that has used the period of pressure to accelerate the structural diversification it should probably have been pursuing for decades before the conflict began. Every tariff that pushed Canadian exports toward European and Asian markets, every threat that motivated Canadian businesses to find non-American customers, every piece of rhetoric that solidified Canadian public opinion against American goods, all of it has contributed to a Canada that is structurally less dependent on the bilateral relationship than it was when the trade war started. The pressure created the conditions for its own diminishing returns. The liquor shelves in Manitoba are still empty. American booze is still absent from LCBO locations across Ontario. The tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and forest products are still in place. The July 1st CUSMA review deadline is approaching without a comprehensive resolution in sight. And Wab Kinew is still on television saying the same thing he has been saying since the beginning. They started it, the condition is tariff removal, and if Washington wants something from Canada, they know what they need to do to get it. He also floated the Epstein Files idea. The internet is still talking about that part, which one suspects was entirely the point.